In the message, there were two videos that we held sacred. The first was the 1953 video, 20th Century Prophet. The second was the 1954 video, The Deep Calleth to the Deep. These were the only two films available to the public with real-life footage of William Branham and the Branham healing campaigns. I found this unusual, considering the fact that they had video recording equipment. The Branham family even had personal video recording equipment, given to them by believers who no doubt wanted them to be used for recording the revivals. But 20th Century Prophet and Deep Calleth to the Deep were the earliest and latest sets of video footage of the prophet in action that we were allowed to see. Reverends LeRoy and Paul Kopp traveled to Jeffersonville to speak with William Branham, while the film crew captured the scene. In the video, those of us who never knew William Branham in person could see inside the prophet's home for a glimpse into his personal life. The Reverend Kopp listened as the prophet told his supernatural story. I remember watching in awe as William Branham told about how the pillar of fire came down over his head. This was a story we heard often, both from the accounts told by William Branham in his sermons and from our pastors who retold what William Branham described in his sermons. We were told that it happened during a debate that William Branham was reluctant to attend. In his sermons, he described how that of the many photographs taken by photographers, God only allowed one single photo to be developed, one which had a halo above his head. He described how George Lacy, the head of the F.B.I., came to verify that it was supernatural, and sent the photo to Washington, D.C. Now that I had found so many factual errors in Branham's testimonies, I began to wonder how many of the details from these stories were true. Now that I was beginning to see the business side of the Branham campaigns, and was being made aware of the types of men who associated with William Branham, I began to wonder, was all of this nothing more than a publicity stunt? When I learned that the Assemblies of God had publicly rejected the religious movement that William Branham himself and unknown financial supporters from the United States had ignited from Canada, and that F.F. Bosworth, who was a member of Branham's campaign team, was a founding father of the Assemblies of God, I began to wonder how this would impact their crowd size. This would have had a very negative impact in the meetings, both for attendance and for income. I began searching for news articles about F.F. Bosworth immediately after the latter rain began to spread into the United States, and I found an article in the January 1950 issue of The Voice of Healing. The Branham Campaign had scheduled a meeting in Houston from January 10th through 27th. They advertised the upcoming revival meetings using scenes from the 1947 healing campaigns at the St. Louis Keel Auditorium with Little David, and the Shrine Auditorium in Phoenix, Arizona. The article invited everyone to attend their Houston, Texas meetings in January. On January 24th, the debate was announced in the newspapers. Both sides claimed that the other challenged them to the debate. I found it odd that William Branham told newspaper reporters that he alone would represent his side, because it was the opposite of what he described when he told the story in his stage persona. In the sermons, Branham said that F.F. Bosworth could go, but only if he didn't argue. After holding a conference with the other Baptist pastors in the area, Reverend W.E. Best said that he would debate once the challenge was formally issued. I also found it interesting that Reverend Best was concerned for his own safety in a non-argumentative discussion with ministers of the gospel. If the campaigns were humble Pentecostal revival meetings, then there should be no fear of physical harm. Reverend Best told reporters that he might need police protection in the Sam Houston Coliseum, all while William Branham continued to claim that he alone would represent his side. Did Reverend Best have inside knowledge about William Branham and the men he associated with? William Branham claimed in his sermons that God would not allow any pictures, with the exception of his halo photograph, to develop. He said, "Every one of them was perfectly negative." The Houston Press covered the debate on January 24, 1950, however, and I suddenly learned that this was not the case. Photographs did develop, and I could see Reverend Best and Reverend Bosworth arguing with each other. Reverend Best explained that he was not opposed to divine healing, but was opposed to divine healers as such, and quoted the Apostle Paul's description of deceivers in the last days. I was shocked as I looked at the number of photographs that did develop. There were several, but I was even more shocked at the violence that erupted in the meetings. Ministers of the gospel were described as swinging their fists, as if they were in a boxing ring. Reverend Best was apparently justified in his fear of the men that Branham associated with. Immediately after the fight broke out, the Baptist ministers fled from the building. It wasn't until after the debate that William Branham took the platform. After a brief speech, William Branham also quickly fled the scene. The reporters described his military-style exit from the building into the night. During the short speech, a photographer did take a photograph of William Branham, the men behind him, and a light above his head. The light, we were told in the message, was the pillar of fire from the Bible. We were told that it was the same evidence that God was with the prophet. The Sam Houston Coliseum hosted many famous acts, some of which were captured in photos and in video. Fortunately, archives of those photographs and videos are now online for me to examine, though it took some time to find them. When I did, it was difficult for me to believe that anyone attending that brief encounter would have even for a second believed that this light was in any way supernatural. In fact, not a single person who attended any nighttime event in the Houston Coliseum would have believed it. For its time, the lighting in the Houston Coliseum was quite advanced. From an NBA basketball game to the legendary John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and the Beatles, the Coliseum's lighting gave the audience a bright view of the stars. Some of the lights could be turned on and off independently, and arrays of lighting could be positioned in various ways. Watching the archived, colorized videos of events held in the Houston Coliseum, a viewer doesn't even notice the lighting. But when the video is paused and cropped and made black and white, it is entirely different. Photographs captured at just the right angle in the Houston Coliseum could be made to look unusual, even supernatural. In today's modern world of technology, we'd think nothing of a photograph like this. We are all familiar with light and its effect on the camera. But in the days of yesteryear, a photograph with a halo was special. This supernatural photograph got a lot of mileage, and the Branham Campaign team seized the opportunity. Over time, they began to enhance the photograph, darkening it to remove the men in the background, who appear to have seen nothing unusual as they sat staring solemnly at the audience. Later colorized, cropped, and altered the photograph to remove surrounding details. Growing up in the message, I saw images of the halo photograph, in color, hang in people's homes and even in churches. There were even those who worshiped the image. Was this light really supernatural? I knew that if I had been shown any other photograph of such a light, my initial impression would be that the image captured man-made lighting, not a supernatural pillar of fire. I was also curious about the rest of William Branham's story. Branham claimed that George J. Lacey, the quote-unquote head of the F.B.I., issued a statement confirming it to be supernatural. Afterward, according to William Branham, it was hung in the Religious Hall of Art in Washington, D.C., as the only supernatural photograph ever captured on film. I wanted to learn more about this George J. Lacey and his position in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It only took a few searches through the Texas newspaper archives to find a wealth of information on Mr. Lacey. In 1921, George J. Lacey was the chief of the Identification Bureau of Texas. He became superintendent during a time when black female prisoners were segregated from white. He found himself in trouble in 1923 when he was accused of physical assault. R.V. Hogan claimed that he saw George Lacey beating an African American. Hogan heard the black man beg for mercy as Lacey knocked him down and continued to kick him. Other witnesses described being beaten by Lacey for making whiskey. One witness claimed that Lacey had struck his only eye, and then he was kicked down the stairs while blinded. Lacey was discharged February 15, 1923, after the allegations were confirmed. The board declared, "No man has a right to take advantage of his authority to show brutality towards helpless prisoners." Somehow, Lacey was magically able to bounce back. Newspapers published an in-depth article describing Lacey's work with the Texas fingerprint system. Lacey opened a private practice named the Lacey Fingerprint Bureau of Houston. This was not what I pictured when I thought about the quote-unquote head of the FBI. I began to wonder, was Lacey also a member of the Ku Klux Klan? During the 1950s, the Ku Klux Klan were installing men into positions of power throughout Texas, and I knew that with his abusive background, it would have made him a prime candidate. I also knew that it was unlikely that George Lacey was ever accepted into the FBI after receiving a dishonorable discharge. Still, I wanted to know more about the man that William Branham used to confirm this quote-unquote supernatural photo. In May of 1934, W. W. Sterling, George J. Lacey, and H. J. Rafin established a non-profit organization for crime detection. W. W. Sterling was Governor Ross S. Sterling's appointed Secretary of State of Texas. The Ku Klux Klan's invasion of public office in Texas has been widely studied since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It is well known that police brutality against African Americans was a problem throughout the southern United States. But in Texas, where Reverend Roy E. Davis had based his operations, men like Lacey beating African Americans was very common. At the same time, it was extremely difficult to find any information about those who escaped prison time. The Ku Klux Klan is a very secretive group, and any documentation about its members and their Klan-related activities, for all intents and purposes, does not exist. Or so I thought. To my surprise, in Texas, where Lacey and Sterling were operating, Klan activity has been well documented. In Houston specifically, the Ku Klux Klan's primary agenda was allegedly moralism and resistance to change. The Klan in Houston was so violent that Klan members were identified and asked to end the violence. Among those named as members in 1923 was Governor Ross S. Sterling, the brother of Lacey's business partner, W. W. Sterling. Ross Sterling was among those who joined the Ku Klux Klan in its early days and was asked to end Klan-attributed violence. Soon after his organization was established, Lacey was asked to test ballistics in criminal trial. He was also asked to administer truth serum. Though he wasn't a federal agent, Lacey's ties to the Texas government enabled him to operate at a state level. By 1938, Lacey had advanced to a position of president of the Texas Division of International Association for Identification. Still, his assisting in criminal trial was far from a federal position. Lacey always remained a private investigator throughout the rest of his career, helping to examine documents for attorneys in criminal trial. I found it interesting to read some of the things that Lacey said in his interviews. Awful statements, and in my opinion, highly inaccurate. One article read, quoting Lacey, "You can study a man and know pretty well how he will act under certain circumstances, but there's no telling what a woman will do, and she has no reason herself for what she does." It goes on to say, "The reason," said Lacey, "is because she has less sense." There is honor among thieves, but not when the women are thieves. When a man drops to criminal life, he can get low, but he can't get as low as a woman criminal. This was exactly what I heard William Branham state in his sermons. Branham's sermons were filled with derogatory statements against women, and he claimed that every crime committed was because of a woman. I was shocked the first time I read the full report written by George J. Lacy concerning the halo above William Branham's head. It did not mention the pillar of fire. It did not mention the supernatural. The photographer did not rush the photo to the F.B.I. None of the things that we believed, not a single aspect of the story that we were trained from birth to accept, was accurate in any way. Gordon Lindsay, of Branham's campaign team, made the request for Lacey to examine the photograph. In his report, Lacey described the scientific method used to confirm the photo was not retouched and that the negative was not altered. He summarized his findings by simply stating that the light in the Coliseum had been captured by the film. This was the exact same way that any professional would describe the photographs of lighting above the head of the Beatles, the basketball players, and any other attraction from the same venue. Should they have access to see the photographs in the archives of the Houston Coliseum records, they might even compare them to Branham's photograph, describing similarities. And they would have laughed at the notion of a religious hall of art in Washington, D.C., because there was no such hall. Learning about the ties to the Ku Klux Klan in Houston, Lacey's brutal beating of African Americans, and the publicity gained from the debate and photograph, I suddenly thought back to the Reverend Kopp, who appeared to be helping Branham gain publicity. Who were they? Why did these two men, who weren't in the message, decide to make this video? Did they really believe the halo story after having been in the bright lights themselves?